So the title of this webinar is Inclusive Leadership for Social Impact. It's led by Earl Givens Jr., who is the director of the Corher Lynn Black Library at Catawba College in North Carolina. So I will hand it over to Earl now.
Hey, thank you, Devin. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for the invite and thanks for showing up, right? So I am Earl Givens Jr. I've been here at the Corher Lynn Black Library for 7 years. So 7 years here in North Carolina. I came here from another state, and I've been in library science for about 13 years now, and I've been doing DEI work for a very long time. And I'm going to talk to you today about doing it from a leadership perspective, though, okay? So a lot of the work that I've done in DEI has really been grassroots kind of boots on the ground. And it's that work, it's very challenging, it's very tiring, it's necessary work. It also exhausted me. And so for a couple of years, I took a hiatus. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit because I had to really find my place and see where I fit in this work, because it was just getting so frustrating and daunting with a lot of the things that you see that happen in society. And it feels like there's no progress made. So I took a couple of years hiatus and just really had to find myself, to be honest with you, because I found myself going to a dark place of no hope. And one of the things that I study religiously is, and am trained in, is leadership. And I study a lot of leadership theories and stuff like that. And so for the first time in my life, I decided to connect leadership theory to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And the results were kind of staggering. I wish I had done it years ago. I already separated the two in my mind, but I started putting the two together, and I'm going to share with you today some of the things that I've been able to make progress on, and different ways to look at it. I will say this: when I'm talking about DEI in this context, we're looking at it from a leadership lens, okay? A leadership lens. All right. And when I say leadership, we're not talking about a position. We're talking about the activity of leadership. So leadership is an activity, not a position. That's the definition we're working with. All right. So let's move forward. Here we go. So what I'm going to talk to you today is, with the short time we have, is one, we're going to talk a little bit about bias. Some of this stuff you already know, and I understand that. We're going to approach it from a leadership angle, though, and that lens. So that might be a little bit different. We're going to build key skills. And then also we're going to learn to work across some boundaries and look at things a little differently. All right. So I'm going to warn you in advance that what you're going to hear today is going to challenge you. And it challenged me the first time I approached it with leadership theory. And it really challenges a lot of what we practice, what we believe, and how we carry out those beliefs and the positions we hold in the work that we do. Because it's taking a leadership lens. And in leadership, we always say, take the balcony view. If you're on a dance floor and everyone is dancing at the same time, it can be difficult to see what's going on the other side of the room. But if you get off of the dance floor and you go to the balcony, then you can start to see the makeup of the room and what's going on. And so for a lot of my life in doing DEI work, I did it a lot on the dance floor, and which is fine. The problem is for real impactful change, you have to do that from the balcony, right? The dance floor gets a lot of the work done, but the balcony sees the vision beyond and what's really going on in the dynamics of the space. And so I've now shifted it at times to the balcony, and then at times I need to shift to the dance floor, right? But this is what we're talking about. So what you're going to hear is going to challenge you. And some of it you might agree with, some of it you won't agree with. That's okay. It's the same for me. And to be honest with you, 100% honest, I've been in a camp where I felt a certain way about this work. And in that camp, no one could move me out of that position. What moved me more toward a more inclusive position and a more leadership oriented position was the lack of results, long lasting results. And so as I completed that little 2-year hiatus journey, and I'm continuing to learn doing this work moving forward, it's challenged a lot of the things that I practiced before fundamentally that weren't as inclusive as I thought they were. So I'm giving you that disclaimer now because it will challenge you. I'm not going to start out by busting your chops, so you'll be okay. Once we get toward the end of this, we'll see where you're at. Okay, so in 2013, I'm going to share this. In 2013, I was in London, England for the first time in my life. And I grew up in a neighborhood that is, I guess you could use the term the ghetto, right? That's the neighborhood I grew up in. Not by choice, it's just all that's what we could afford. So that was life. And grew up in that neighborhood, lived in that neighborhood. So whenever I go to any place, regardless of what city it is, the ghetto is my home. So I go to Philadelphia, the hood is my home. I know that's my group. I know how to move. I know how to act. I know the language. That's how I operate. So when I went to London in 2013, I saw a lot of people who looked like me, and I felt some kinship to those individuals, regardless of what part of the world they're in. And they quickly let me know I wasn't like them. And the reason why is because many of the people who look like me who live in that area are first or second generation removed from Africa, and their features are different than mine. I'm by some people, I'm just a black man, but if you look closely, I have Native American features. My grandmother is full-blooded Choctaw, and and of course I have African American blood there, but I look different than they do, and they reminded me of that, and that let me know that just because in this country I'm an African American and I have a place in a certain group, if I go to another country, even with the skin tone I have, I'm not in that group. And that group let me know that. And that group was interested in learning more about me, and I was interested in learning more about them. And so it was a pretty cool conversation, but it did open my eyes to something that I was not familiar with, that outside of America, I'm not considered part of a certain group that people put me in. So it really made me think about the world, but not too much, not too deeply. I came back to the States and I really started doing my work again and just getting back into what I always do. And the lack of results, as I talked about earlier, really drove me to a different place. So here we are today. So in order for you to receive what I'm going to share with you, you have to clear your mind, and you're going to have to see the world differently, as I began to do based on the experiences and social narrative that I had. Okay, so let's move forward. So I promised you we talk about bias. Let's do it. When we're talking about bias, there's two key questions I like to throw out. How aware am I of my own biases? And how do I begin to learn about others who are different? All right. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves a lot because we have blind spots. So the biases that we have, we're not really aware of, but there are those who do see them. You should study the Johari window kind of theory that helps shed some light on that. We're not going to go over that today, but the Johari window will help you unmask things, find those things that are unknown, look at your blind spots, and be more vulnerable in things that are known to others and that as well. It makes you a more well-rounded individual. It's actually more empowering than you think. But there are people around us who know our biases. They see them every day, and they also know your character. And that's the key. If you can consult with those people who know your character, who know your heart, then it's easy to ask the question about bias and not take that in a way that is tearing you down in your character, but take it as a way of constructive criticism in a place where we can grow. So how aware am I of my own biases? You know, tough question to ask. If you're not aware, ask those who know your character and who care about you, and see what you find out. And then um, once you know that, there has to be some strategies built in to give you progress on learning about how to move beyond those biases. So we are all part of groups. I talked about this earlier about the groups I'm involved in here in America that I'm put in either voluntarily or by nature. But we're all part of groups, right? So social grouping, right? Psychology theory. So we're all part of several groups. We either are part of these groups by choice, or we are thrown into these groups based off of culture and society around us. But we are all part of a group, whether you're at a church or you're a librarian or a lawyer, you're all part of a group, a team. I'm a former athlete, and I'm a part of a group with other athletes, current and former athletes. You know, we may not have played the same sport, but we've had some similar experiences, and it puts us in a similar group, right? We can have conversations that people who have not competed in athletics can't. People who enjoy the sport, that's great, but it's not the same as actually doing it, right? So we're part of another group, right? It doesn't make us any better than anyone else, but we're part of a closer knit group. And we all do this, right? So we have this in our organization. We're all part of social groups within our organization. We're all part of social groups in society. And these groups have their own languages. These groups have their own roles, right? And a lot of this is subconscious, right? So 72% of what we do is done subconsciously. Like blinking your eyes right now, you're not thinking about it until I just said it. You know, it's a subconscious behavior. Breathing, subconscious. Walking, not unless you've had a problem that makes you think about whether you need to walk or not. We just get up and do it. You know, it's subconscious, and 23% of everything else we do is conscious, right? It's so subconsciously we put people in these groups in our minds, and we join different groups, right? So we give these groups names, right? Some of the things you see here, these are parts of the groups, right? And we don't have any definition for it. Like in one of these, the word black is here. I thought I was black till I went to London. Apparently I'm not black, right? Not according to their standard. According to the way they define it, I'm not part of the group that is black, right? But in America, I am. So groups mean different places, mean different things wherever they're regionally located as well, right? So all these groups exist. And it's important because there are two major groups we're going to talk about, right, as far as DEI goes. All right, so let's focus this in a little bit. So there are your in groups and there are your out groups. And your in groups, Raider Nation here, right? Your in groups are how you define and see yourself and how other people define and see you, right? Those, they put you in these groups. So your in group, this is just for you now. Your in group is your group that's based on your identity. If we identify by our race, if we identify by our religion, by our gender, our profession, those are our in groups, right? And with that, we give preferential treatment or in-group bias to those who are in our in-group. We subconsciously do this because if we're more similar to people who are part of our in-group, then we also subconsciously give them in-group bias that we would give people who are part of our in-group, okay? Remember, this is from a leadership perspective. So we give insider tendencies, we assign insider roles, you know, to people who are in our in-groups. Our in-groups have their own language, right? And everybody in the in-group knows it. If you're in the out-group and you don't know it, you know, sucks to be you. You're not in the in-group. But we have more patience with people who are in our in-group, right? Because they're part of our in-group. Surely they can't, what they said can't possibly be true. They meant something different because they're part of our in-group. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, right? That's how we treat people who are part of our in-group. And remember, we don't have to meet these people to form these groups. So that's why we see a lot of the comments online when something happens in our world, especially when it's race related. when something happens in our world and somebody will come to someone's defense and say, oh, but this person is a good kid, or if you would have known them before this, it's why are they doing that? They're not looking at the act that took place. They're looking at the in-group bias that they're giving that person. They identify with that individual in some shape, form, or fashion as that individual being part of their in-group. So because of that, we unconsciously give them all of the rights and privileges that come with someone being part of your in-group, whether you've met them or not. Okay, so there is a flip side to this. Within groups, there's also outgroups, right? And your outgroup is made up of people who you see as not like you. And that doesn't have to be anything racial. Sometimes it is, oftentimes it is subconsciously. It just, that's the way we're wired in our country, unfortunately. So, so subconsciously, that's how it happens, right? But your outgroup can be people who you've had a bad experience. Remember, they're shaped by your social narrative. Maybe I've had a bad experience with attorneys, with lawyers, and so now anybody says that their profession is they're an attorney, they're part of my outgroup because of my social narrative and the experience that I've had with them, a repeating experience, not a one-time thing, which helped shape what I think of as people who are part of an outgroup. And because of that, because we're less familiar with those people, we're less trusting of them, we're less patient, and we're less interested in them being members of our in-group, okay? So because of those things, we're now practicing outgroup discrimination, right? And with outgroup discrimination, because we don't know who these people are at all, and we have no interest in bringing them into our in-group, then we have to fill the space of knowledge, of the lack of knowledge that we have about individuals in our outgroup. So what we do is we perceive those members as through the lens of stereotypes and overgeneralizations to fill the gaps of the lack of knowledge we have about them. And this happens all the time. And we do this in entertainment. That's why you have so many comedy skits about how someone who is white acts or someone who is black acts, we do this all the time. And so these stereotypes and overgeneralizations come forward, and then we fill our knowledge gaps with those, right? And then as a result, that subconscious behavior comes forward, and we treat people like that because they're part of our outgroup, and we do it subconsciously. We don't even have to think about it, right? It's because they're part of our outgroup. So here's the deal. Here's the challenge. The challenge I have is for us to convert those who are part of our outgroup into our in-group. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but the biggest way you can do it is to immerse yourself into an outgroup culture. If you immerse yourself in an outgroup culture, then you're forced to either withdraw inside yourself or reach out and have to start trying to understand the people around you and bringing those from your outgroup into your in-group. And the way you do that is you do it through identifying similarities, right? If you can celebrate similarities and honor differences, right, then you can start to convert people from your outgroup into your in-group. For an example, I can meet different people, and because I was in athletics for a long time, and a very long time before I became a librarian, right? I can identify somebody and look at them and tell that they're either athletic, or I can tell what sport they play just on the build of their body, right? Because I was in it for a long time. And then after that, I did personal training of athletes as well. So I can identify that. That's a similarity because I was once an athlete, right? So I can strike up a conversation with anybody, anywhere. Doesn't matter the color of their skin, whatever. And they're part of my in-group, right? Now, growing up, I wasn't always the best student, and I've worked really hard in my life to catch up on a lot of the things that I missed that were taught in school, because my focus was totally on my sport and going professional in my sport. So I didn't get to learn the things that I missed. And in the culture I grew up in, nobody was really concerned about making sure that I learned it. It was just kind of pass you through. So there's a lot I missed out on. So as a result, I've missed out on a lot of that intellectual culture that I've been trying to reclaim now. And because of that, there's a lot that I'm missing. There's a lot of gaps there of a lot of things that people know that I just don't know, right? So I'm ever learning and ever studying. The point of this is whenever those conversations start in places where I'm at, those people are part of my out group, right? Because that's a world that I don't feel I'm completely in yet, right? I'm working hard to get in that world, but I'm not completely there. So unfortunately, because for me, there's not a lot of people in library science who have the same story that I have, so who look like me. So I'm always immersed in a culture at conferences and everything of people who are sometimes in my out group. And I've learned through similarities, honoring by celebrating similarities and honoring differences, how to convert people from my out group to my in group and vice versa, right? So that's our challenge that we have as we're doing DEI work and we're noticing subconscious bias and in-group, out-group preferences and this bias and discrimination is the challenge is converting those from the out-group to the in-group. All right, so let's shift a little bit. So that was just one thing we talked about when it comes to bias. There's so many different biases out there that we don't have time to cover today, but I wanted to make sure that we hit that. And let's talk about building key skills. So critical question. What critical baseline skills do I have for acting in a more inclusive way? So we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion a lot in our society. And we talk about some of the things that need to happen for us to move toward a more inclusive society and inclusive organizations and developing organizational culture beyond initiatives. However, what we lack in those conversations is the key skills needed to bring people there. One of the key skills that I'm going to share with you today, because that's all we have time for, is called active listening. So you hear a lot in our society about some of the ways that we can make progress on the issues that are going on in our organizations and in our world and in our libraries is to have more communication. I disagree with that because I think the key is active listening. We can communicate and talk, but without the active listening piece, there is no progress. You have a lot of angry people who are communicating, right? So this comes from the world of professional coaching, right? When I was being certified as a professional coach, like life coach, one of the first things they taught us is the levels of listening. There's actually 9, and then there's a sub one that's the 3 levels of active listening, which I'm going to share with you today. All right. So there are 3 levels to active listening that will actually build your skills in having difficult conversations so that you can be fearless when you're having conversations that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. The first thing we need to do is define diversity. So traditionally, what we do in how we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion is we take the whole gambit of DEI. We take the entire gambit and we try to work on everything at the same time. We try to work on diversity, understanding of people, perspectives, and culture. We try to work on equity and policy and practice and position. And we try to do inclusion with empowerment and voice and organizational culture. Problem is this. It's very difficult to do equity and inclusion without a healthy understanding of diversity. Because if you can understand people, perspective, and culture, it makes equity and inclusion that much easier to do. So when doing the work in equity and doing the work in inclusion, if you don't have the true understanding of diversity in the first place, then the things that you put in place are initiatives that never change the culture. And those initiatives end because you either run out of the will or the resources to continue them because they don't make progress. So we're talking about this from the balcony view now, okay? So stay with me. It's good to do the initiatives. It's good to bring notoriety and attention to it. But if we don't have the leadership perspective of diversity, the understanding of people perspective and culture, then the equity and inclusion initiatives stay initiatives and never become part of culture, and there is no change. Let me give you an example. Black History Month, great initiative, sensational, right? However, that's still the approach for everything. Pride Month, Women's History Month, right? Latino Month. Why? Because it's not part of culture yet, right? Because there has not been a true understanding of diversity. The true understanding of people, their perspectives, and their culture, and where that and that piece of it inside of American culture. It is part of it. Black history is American history, right? It should be. There shouldn't have to be an initiative for that, right? So this is where we're at. And this is why what I'm saying today is counterculture, right? It's because it's the transition from the initiative to actually making it a part of culture. Active listening builds the skill to help with that. So let's dig a little deeper and look at that. So the first level, level 1, is called internal listening, okay? So in internal listening, the attention is focused on the listener, okay? Because the listener is listening to respond. This is why this graphic is showing this individual is only really listening within. So you're interacting with someone, they're talking to you, you're listening to yourself, not really them. You're listening to yourself so that you can respond, right? Let me give you an example. We just had Memorial Day weekend. So at some point this week, when you came back to work, you asked someone, how was your weekend? All right. And they told you how their weekend was, which is great. You didn't really hear everything because you were internal listening. You were listening at level 1. Guarantee you, most of us on this call were listening at level 1 because after they shared, you shared how your weekend was, whether they asked you or not. That's listening at level 1. Okay. When we talk about having conversations when it comes to DEI, many people listen at level 1. They listen to respond. So something is shared and then they respond to it. And when we respond, it's usually personal and it's emotional, right? And then the person who hears you responds to that with a personal or emotional response. And now we have conflict and friction, right? There is no growth. There is no understanding. There is no building of key skills. Why? Because we listened at level 1, okay? We listened to respond. We did not listen to learn. Now, level 1 listening is appropriate at times. When you're going to buy a car or buy a home, you should listen at level 1. I don't really care what the salesperson is telling me. They need to know what I want, right? Because I'm the one who's stuck with the bill on this, and I'm the one who's stuck with this car or this house, right? So absolutely, level 1 listening is perfect. But when you're trying to actually make progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion, level 1 is inappropriate. All right, where we really need to be is level 2. So level 2 is called focus listening. This is where the attention is on the speaker, all right? And we listen to learn. We listen to learn. So when someone is speaking to you and they share something, especially if it's deeply personal, and it's a story that you can relate to, and in fact, you have a similar experience, and then you have an opportunity to interject, don't. Because once you interject and share your experience, you have transitioned the conversation from level 2 back to level 1. It is about you again, right? Do not share. Listen to learn. File that experience away for another day, but listen to learn. When we share, because we think we're connecting, what we're actually doing is devaluing the testimony and experience that that individual has had, because we're now focusing the conversation back on us, right? So this is level 2 listening. This is hard to do. You have to practice this. When you're level 2, when you're at level 2 and you're listening, you ask powerful questions. When there's space to talk, you ask questions. Powerful questions are questions like, how did that make you feel? Because I'm listening to learn, right? This is how we understand people, perspective, and culture, right? So how did that make you feel? What advice would you give somebody who's experiencing the same thing, right? What does that do? That helps you learn how they learned from that and the growth, right? Beyond the emotional situation that happened, not just how they would do it differently, but how they would educate someone else. You're listening to learn, okay? You're not listening to respond. If there's something you have to share that's related to it, don't share it unless you've been invited into the conversation by that person to share it. If they say, have you had a similar experience like this? Now it's your turn to transition to level 1. If they don't invite you, you do not share. That's counterculture. What we're normally taught is we're connecting when we have similar experiences. In DEI work, you're not connecting, you're devaluing, okay? Because you're listening to learn. We're listening to learn. When you practice this, practice it with people who know your character and people who know your heart, because you will make mistakes. It takes a while to hone this skill, all right? But it is an essential skill to have when you're trying to learn about people, perspective, and culture. Okay, so that's level 2. So let's look at level 3. All right, this is the final level. This is called whole body listening, or if you Google it, I think the new term is 360 listening. So 360 listening. This is listening beyond what's being said, okay? This is listening and looking at gestures, eye contact or lack thereof, breathing, you know, but more so the intuition of what's not being said. Let me give you an example. So when I first moved to North Carolina, I'm from the Midwest. So the history in the Midwest is the roots of it are really based in agriculture and Native American history. And we don't have colonial history like that, not like here in North Carolina. So as a historian, I decided when I moved to North Carolina, I kind of wanted to look at some of the things that are going on around here and in the region around here, because it has the colonial history that in the Midwest we don't have, right? And so I was sharing that with some friends of mine who live local, and I said, hey, I'm going to be doing some local traveling, and I'm going to look at some of this colonial history. Now, I want you to pay attention to this example. I said, so I'm going to be traveling throughout, Virginia and South Carolina, and just kind of looking around and doing the same in North Carolina. And they responded by saying, you're going to love it. There's a lot of history here, which there is, and that's great. And that's why, I want to do this journey. There's a lot of history here, and you're going to love looking at a lot of the architecture, a lot of the giant houses and everything like that. This was my response. I think I'm probably going to stay away from the houses, but I am going to look at some of the other things. All right. What's not being said there? Right. This is whole body listening or 360 listening here. All right. What's not being said is this: I'm staying away from the houses because these are plantations and this is not a happy place for me. That's what I didn't say. Right. That's whole body listening. That's 360 listening. That's what's necessary to develop when doing DEI work. What's not being said, right? Now, I'm not going to paint a rosy picture to you and say that this is easy to practice. Level 3, it takes a very long time to hone this skill, and you will only get it after mastering level 2, right? So it's a lot of practice, but it's necessary to understand what's not being said. This is how cultural change starts to happen within your organization or in whatever work you're doing. In order for something to go beyond an initiative, there has to be a true understanding, and you can do that through active listening, right? And the culture then starts to change, because as you learn more, then you can start changing the culture around you that makes it a more inclusive environment, right? So the individual and their family members who I was talking to didn't pick up on that. They didn't pick up on it, and I didn't expect them to. So even after I said I might stay away from the houses, they continued to proceed and talk to me about am I sure, all the beautiful homes that are there, I'm going to miss out on this. And they start naming all the plantations. Look, I'm not interested. But they didn't know that. And I didn't throw it in their face either, because they don't understand that. Right now, later, a few months later, we had a conversation about it. And now there's growth there. Right. But at the time, they didn't get it. And I recognize it because many of us do not have this basic key skill of active listening to make progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right. So let's keep rolling. All right. So barriers to diversity and inclusivity. Now, this is very important because even if you have developed the active listening skills, you really need to be aware of some of these other things that lead to some of these macro inequities. So let's deal with this, okay? The challenge here is to become more aware of your micro inequities. We're all familiar with macro inequities. We hear about them every single day, right? Sexism, racism, ageism, transphobia, you name it, it's out there. And those get addressed for the most part. When they arise and we're forced to address them, we deal with them, right? No big deal. What we don't deal with is the micro inequities that lead to the macro inequities that we all see. But it's the micro inequities that are multiplied together that cause the macro inequity to come to the surface, right? So whole body listening, right? We talked about that, 360 listening. You should be able to see macro inequities in gestures, right? In tone, in actions, in words, right? This is why active listening is so important. A lot of this is rooted in unconscious bias, all right? So let me give you an example of this. And this is something that we do every day. And you're probably doing it in this meeting right now, right? So if you are, this has nothing to do with you. I planned this ahead of time. Macro inequity, you're in a conversation or you're in a presentation with somebody and they continue to check their phone, all right? Macro inequity. It gives me the impression that I'm not that important and I'm not worth your time, right? And that's for everybody. Why is it a macro inequity? Because based on someone's social narrative and based on their past experiences, let's say they've had a real bad past experience with a race issue or something, and it looks like you're ignoring them within the conversation now because of my social narrative and my past experience, I can say to myself, they always ignore me, and I see them do it to another minority. They ignore that minority too. That person's racist. Whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. Perception's reality, right? And it's like that because of a micro inequity, right? Something as simple as checking my phone continually while I'm supposed to be in a conversation and be active listening, right? Here's another one, greeting someone else more warmly than I greet another person. This has happened to me personally within the last year. And I try to stay aware of this, but we had a new employee start here at our organization, and they were walked over to my library to meet me. And the person who walked them over, I gave them a hug because I hadn't seen him in a while, because COVID and everything been closed for a while. So I gave them a hug. They introduced a new employee to me and I shook their hand. Person called me out. So you dished out a hug, but I'm chopped liver, right? I was like, oh, shoot, here's the way I could have handled that. The person I knew who I hadn't seen in a while could have shook their hand. If they would have invited me in and said, hey, give me a hug, bring it in, I haven't seen you, then I can offer that to the new person that they're bringing to meet me. Hey, as you see, we're huggers. Do you want a hug or you want me to shake your hand, right? So now there's no micro inequity, okay? These are little things, but they matter because everyone's social narrative is different. And because of our past experiences, we see the world differently through a different paradigm, like those kids in London did, right? People I told you about earlier. We see it differently. And then it leads to the macro inequity, right? Talking over someone in a meeting. Every time a person is speaking, you talk over them, right? Happens all the time in our professional world. But What's happening also at the same time in our professional world is based on everyone's social narrative. The people who are minorities think that the person talking over them is racist. The people who are non-males are feeling like they're being looked over and pushed down on, right? That they're not being respected, right? So, the list goes on and on. So these are micro inequities when put together create macro inequities, whether they are true or not. And they happen because of unconscious bias. Some of it is intentional. I'm not an idiot, right? There's some people who are just jerks and they do it on purpose. But a lot of it is unconscious bias, right? So active listening is the key in practicing that and being aware, right? Being aware, let's start over. It's being aware of the in groups and out groups and converting those into your in group. And then also being aware in how you do active listening and how you practice it so that you can truly learn about people, perspectives, and culture, and being aware of your micro inequities, right? All right, so let's keep rolling. So this is the last thing I told you I'd talk to you about, right? You've been a great audience listening to me ramble, so thank you. Working across boundaries, all right? So this is where the things get a little bit more challenging, okay, that I talked about earlier. What you're gonna hear from this moment on is counterculture, and it will challenge you to lead. Like leadership, the way we define leadership is it's an activity, not a position. So anyone is equipped to lead anytime, anywhere. It must involve you and engage others, and leadership is risky. So it's not going to be always with the culture. It's not always going to be with what everybody believes, but it'll be what's best, right? For progress that lasts and is sustainable. So how successful am I in working with various diverse groups when you're working across boundaries? And these are groups that aren't necessarily in the same camp that you're in, okay? How do you work across those boundaries? And maybe we need to start blurring the line and redefining boundaries. So here's a good example. As before we get into that, I want to give you some courage here. Martin Luther King Jr. I love this quote. A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. So when we're doing this kind of work with the boundaries and we're going to lead, we're doing exactly that, leading. We're not searching for everybody's approval, but we are looking for the best way forward. And I'm going to be honest with you. When I took that 2-year hiatus and I really had to dig in and find out whether I wanted to even do this work anymore in the current society that we had, one place I looked was in the writings of Martin Luther King Jr. And the reason I went there is because there's, for the success that's happened in the past 100 years, MLK has been one of the most successful individuals. There have been others, Medgar Evers, and Malcolm X in some respect. And I mean, there are others. MLK has been the most successful. So what I wanted to do is dig into his writings where he did a lot of his true work, and that was in his church. If you look at the history of the grassroots movement for civil rights, it's a lot of it is done in the churches because it was an easy place where you had the legal right to meet and you could deliver material to people to organize and do the work that was needed, that was boots on the ground in a safe form or fashion, where for the most part, people weren't coming in and dragging you out of your church and stopping you from meeting. There were bombings and things of that nature, those acts of violence that were intentional. But it was also still the place where a lot of the work is done. Unfortunately, when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and we look at a lot of his work, we look at a lot of the public speeches he made in Washington, D.C. and in around the world and other places, but we don't look at the writings and the sermons he had in the church, which is where the grassroots stuff began. So I start digging into that, and that's what helped me form this framework that I've been putting together over the past 2 years. in how to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because a lot of those writings give you more context to the things that he said publicly, mainstream for everyone to hear. The stuff that was at the grassroots level was even more impactful. So I challenge you to kind of look into that. It'll really empower you and set you on the path to do some life-changing work. So when we talk about boundaries and leading, as MLK says, we have to be a molder of consensus, which means this. Part of working across boundaries is blurring the lines and redefining definitions, having the courage to redefine. So maybe disability is part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's traditionally treated as separate. We have DEI and we have ADA, and that's over here and this is over there. And when you need something in the DEI camp that has to do with ADA, you reach out to the ADA camp and you do that, and maybe you can work together. Maybe the line is blurred. Maybe the line doesn't exist, right? Courage to lead. Maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe we stop giving disability to someone else to figure out, and maybe we do that. Every part of what we do when we talk about DEI, ADA is at the heart of it. It's not separate anymore. Do we have all the answers? No. That's where you partner and bring in the help for sustainability, but it's not an afterthought. So we need to ask ourselves questions. Is our environment as inclusive as we say it is? Here's an example. If I have a student who comes into my library to use my services, who is blind, can, with the help of an associate, can they scan an article or something and get it in a form, or a book, and get it in the format that best fits them? Do I have that capability? Can they scan a document and the document be an ebook or an audiobook, excuse me? If they can't, am I inclusive as I say I am when I put in that new piece of scanning technology? Was it at the heart of inclusion? Was it at the heart of equity? Was it at the heart of diversity, understanding people, perspective, and culture? I left out a whole culture when I made that decision and putting in that scanner that only worked for those who had ability, right? But it didn't empower those who might process information in a different way so that they can receive it in the way that best fits them. Someone who's dyslexic, same thing. Maybe the audio book works better when they scan something, right? Maybe that works better for them. Did I give them that option? Or did I just create this structure for those with ability and those who are non-dyslexic, right? So embracing disability into DEI, maybe that's blurring the line. Maybe it's removing the line, or maybe that's where it should always be, right? Having the courage to lead. So can an individual who is deaf come into my library and have a rich experience? Can someone who has a sensory processing disorder have a space in my building where there's calming light, where there's not a lot of sound, so that they can have a rich experience in my building, right? Maybe that line needs to be blurred now. Maybe that's part of DEI, courage to lead, right? Let's keep rolling. Racism. Let's take a look at that. All right, this is where things get really challenging. So if you hate me, I'm cool. I can take it. We can have a conversation. I'm good. So the Anti-Defamation League in New York City, they've been doing a lot of work for many years now, over 100 years. They define racism as this. Racism is seeing someone else's humanity as less valuable than your own humanity. That definition removes color. That definition says that anyone can be racist, regardless of color, regardless of power. It's the process of devaluing someone else's humanity and seeing it less valuable than your own, right? So that means people can be racist for many different reasons. They can be racist for color. They can be racist because your accent is different, right? There can be tribalism, castes. You can be racist for many different reasons, but it applies to everyone because it's a balcony view and everyone is held accountable, right? Everyone is held accountable for their actions. And that is true equity, right? If that's what we're saying. That's challenging to hear, okay? But redefining those terms to make long-lasting progress. Let's do it one more term, and I'm gonna back off of you, okay? Privilege, okay? Let's talk about that. If I stay in higher education and continue to work, my kids will get to go to Catawba College for free, which is great. Some might even say that they're privileged. And because they're Black, maybe we should call it Black privilege. Or maybe it's earned privilege. You know, I did work hard to earn it. I've suffered through a lot to make sure that they get a free education. So not saying that, when I keep in mind, when I'm saying this stuff, it has to do with leadership and leadership purposes only, okay? In leadership, we must be inclusive enough to make progress and long-lasting progress, sustainable progress on these hard issues. So when we approach something like white privilege, it is hard to make long-lasting progress in that area by using that term, because it vilifies another group of individuals. Is there privilege there? Yes, there is. Let's acknowledge that, okay? But a more inclusive term for true social impact, and a way to define it, is probably earned and unearned privilege, okay? So let's talk about that. There is privilege that people have earned, like the example I had for my kids, right? I earned that. I'm still earning it, right? I hope they get to benefit from that and have no college debt. That's earned privilege. But then there's privilege that people have not earned, that they walk around in every day. It's unearned privilege. We need to understand the weight of our unearned privilege. But in another part of the world, that unearned privilege does not have color attached to it, because in some parts of the world, being a white American means you're the villain. So you do not have white privilege, right? Right? We're looking at it from a leadership perspective. So from a leadership perspective, a more inclusive way to define it is earned and unearned privilege, right? Helps start the conversation, and it helps start the education. We need everybody to be educated on the issues so change can happen and it can be sustainable. As long as people are on the outside, because we don't have a way of inviting them in, the very people you need for change will not be educated enough to help you do it, and there will be constant friction. And what will happen is we will run out of the will or resources to continue to stay in the game. Okay. All right, so challenge you a little bit. Let's roll it back just a bit. All right, I want to keep you engaged. All right. If you're looking at this picture, right now, you're looking around and you're looking at different people, and we all do this, you're having an internal conversation right now. You're having what we call a race conversation. We all do this, all right? So you're looking at people and you're just kind of figuring out what they look like. One guy looks like a beach bum or whatever. Could be a doctor or a lawyer. I don't know that. I didn't allow that individual to self-disclose. I decided that in my mind based on my own social narrative, right? But we all do this. And we're having an internal conversation with ourselves. And one thing I want to challenge you to do in doing this work is to take your conversation that's internal and turn it into a consultation, okay? Allow people to self-disclose who they are, and allow them to give themselves the opportunity to share their why and who, and you learn from them, so that we can stop the conversation in our mind and convert people into our in-group by consulting people. A lot of times when we've already prejudged them based on our own social narrative, we don't give individuals the opportunity to even self-disclose who they are, and we've put them in their camp, right? And so once we do that, based on just reading their name. I love it when people read my name, Earl Givens Jr., and I show up to an interview and people are surprised at what I look like. It's hilarious to me, and I hold back the laughter because they read my name, didn't do a Google search, and they realized that I'm not Caucasian, right? So it's fun to see the surprise. But what they did is they read my name and had an internal conversation based on my name, right? So the last thing I'll leave you with is move away from conversation and move into consultation internally. Start practicing active listening. start uncovering your blind spots, and work hard to convert people from your out group to your in group. And finally, if you want to make some long-lasting change, have the courage to lead, the courage to redefine terms, the courage to be as inclusive as possible. So thank you very much. And thank you for joining. If you have any questions, shoot them to me. I can take it. Any comments, shoot them my way.
And feel free to unmute yourself as well if you'd like to just do that. That's totally fine. We have one question from Cynthia. She says, I just have one comment. What if you are, oh, let's see. Let me pull this up.
Yeah, what if you aren't comfortable hugging someone you don't know? Hey, that's cool. Like, I have a thing about that. You know, somebody could have lice, man. I ain't getting that on myself. I'm dressed too clean for that, right? We ain't doing that. So, so if you're uncomfortable hugging somebody who you don't know, just make sure that you treat everybody, give everybody the exact same level of respect, right? So, and that's fine too. I don't hug everybody, especially in this day and age. I don't want to be accused of anything. Okay, just being real here. So I give the handshake. Once we build that relationship, hey, you get a hug, but everybody gets the handshake, especially if it's somebody new. Even if it's with somebody who I have a deep relationship with, I treat them equally, especially after that experience a year ago, right? Open my eyes. So try to treat them equally and establish that comfort level. But it's not a requirement. You don't have to hug everybody.
We have a question from Dina here. If you see an example of a microaggression in retrospect, would you recommend apologizing?
It depends on, I think an apology, a sincere apology is always good because it lets the other party know that you are thinking and that you are growing, especially if they know your character. If they know your character, an apology is great because it's like, look, and be honest with them, be vulnerable. I'm learning, and let them know I would like to, if you allow me, I would like to learn along with you. I want to learn. You know, that's the best way. It's a great question. Any other questions?
Don't be shy.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna drop my email in the chat. I thought I put it on the slide, but I forgot. So if you have anything you want to holler at me about, you can shoot me an email. That's cool too. How do you get better at level 3 listening? All right, to get better at level 3 listening, you really have to practice level 2 religiously. Like level 2 listening is really important because once you hone that, the intuition and everything that you hone in your subconscious will be a part of that, and it'll help you start to blend and move into level 3 without you even thinking about it. But it starts at the level 2 level. You have to learn to listen, ask powerful questions, and the more you do it, you can start to see the gestures in the way people answer. If someone looks away, you notice it's something hard, right? When they have to respond to you. So now you know whether you should push that further for learning or whether you should back off if there's something deeper that you need to connect to. But you start to see that, right? All right, so I dropped my information in the chat. You got a question you're uncomfortable to ask, you can throw it in there. Or if you just got feedback that's rough, you can give it to me. Look, I'm the leadership guy. I hear some rough stuff all the time. It doesn't matter. I don't get mad. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I'm comfortable with it. So just drop it on me.